I appreciate you all coming out on this night. These are busy times, these are trying times, and I really am pleased to have this opportunity to chat with you about a piece of the sorts of things that I'm invested in. I really appreciate this invitation, so thank you, Martin, and thank you others for making this possible. What I've chosen to do here, Martin has been very good about telling me not to make this kind of thing too academic. And that can be a comfort zone. I can return to that concept actually in a little bit. That can be a comfort zone for people who are talking about things within academia and those specialized spaces. But what's really important in the kind of research that I've conducted and the commitments that I've made now for over a decade is that it is important to meet people where they are. It's important to understand what motivates people, what finds traction in productive discussions on this 21st century challenge. And so in doing so, one has to often let go of some of that specialized language. One has to surrender to the fact that if one really wants to meet people where they are and make some progress and find and bridge some of these spaces across the ideological spectrum, cultural, societal, political spaces, that we need to do that work together. So if there's at any point, if I'm getting a little bit academic about this, I don't think that I will tonight, but always raise your hand and ask me any questions about the sorts of things that I'm going to talk about. Perhaps the most deliberately academic piece of this may be in the title itself. And so the title, I talk about cultural politics. And this is a concept that really is just merging of the important cultural dimensions of these issues, climate change, which cuts to the heart of how we live, work, relax, play in society, how those cultural components then feed into and interact with political decision making. So I sit at the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research, which is one of 4 centers within the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. So I approach this through the merging of culture and politics. As I interface on a regular basis, I sit with many physical, biological scientists, and it is a very, I think, a great place from which to then explore how meaning from the sciences is constructed, how it's negotiated across space and place, how certain ways of discussing the important scientific ways of knowing, experiential, aesthetic ways of knowing can find traction, where there are certain discussions that are prevalent, and where there actually are discussions that are absent or at times muffled. And so these are then questions about how people make sense of and value the world. And these are also, they involve analyses of power, the processes of who has a say and who doesn't. And oftentimes there's this inverse relationship that those at the forefront of climate impacts are those that don't have a voice in these discussions going forward. So this gets at questions of equity, equality, and so forth, that manage the conditions of our lives, that feed through our shared spaces, that circulate through networks to produce the ways that we talk about it, would then feed into the ways that we act in the world. So I'm really committed to, in approaching these things, helping to expand the spectrum of possibility. There are people who prescribe certain decision-making actions. There's certain things that I do personally that feed into my professional life, certainly, but the commitments that I make are to expanding that space. And so over time, I've done a lot of research in different areas, one of which I can allude to for a little bit at some point in this talk, is following contrarian movements, which are often mapped onto right-wing social movements that call into question the essential, whether the climate is changing, whether humans play a role, and so forth and so on. And rather than naming and shaming certain actors within contrarian counter movements, I've been compelled to engage and better understand where they're coming from, because I think that that's the bridge building that needs to be done. So, I hope that I don't waver into too much remedial work as well, but I think it can be useful for us just to talk briefly about the ways that there has been engagement from science, some dimensions of understanding human contributions to climate changes. Then I move into some policy dimensions and then get into the creative spaces. So into creative ways of meeting people where they are, creative ways of engaging on these issues for different audiences across the political spectrum. So traditional ways of engaging on this issue have often come through this scientific way of knowing about the world. Here's just a smattering of a number of reports that have come out at the international level mainly, but some US level statements, US mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization, which came out in November, just before the US presidential election, preceded by a month from opportunities to enhance the nation's resilience to climate change, really focusing in on this scientific way of knowing about the issue, working to compel action. Now, this certainly isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but there is this danger, there is this potential trap that those that are producing the science, that those who are engaged in these endeavors can start to feel like if we just provide everybody with the right information on this, they will then make the quote-unquote correct choice. They will then take the action that maximizes their ability to alleviate climate change, right? We realize in our complicated lives that it doesn't work that way, that really there are these webs of interaction that's influenced in part by scientific ways of knowing, but is also influenced by the places where we congregate, our religious communities, our social spheres, our neighbors, our families, and so forth. And so Brian Wynn, who's in Science and Technology Studies, has talked about this danger of the deficit model, which basically says if you just give people more information, they're going to do the right thing. It is dead, but it lives on. So when I began talking about, I can fall into this specialized language, all of us who are working on things in our specialized spaces can fall into this trap of just trying to provide that information to help move the needle, to help sway public opinion, to help sway public engagement, and so forth. But really, Suzanne Mosier has been doing a lot of work in this area. She's pointed out, I think, quite well over time, that providing information and filling knowledge gaps is at best necessary, but rarely sufficient to create active behavioral engagement. And so to add on to her comment just a bit, it's the notion of sustained behavioral engagement that's very important here. That the commitments that we make in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere stay with us anywhere up to 200 years residence time in the atmosphere. There's a common saying that, the Model T Ford, the emissions in the early 1900s are those that we're dealing with today. So the kind of sustained behavioral engagement that's necessary is what we need to focus on. So talking about carbon footprints just a little bit, there are two ways that are often discussed. And so I apologize that this might be a little bit small to be able to read these individual countries. On the right-hand side is the country level emissions. This is a dynamic thing, but this is a relatively recent take on that. This is mapped onto this figure here, carbon emissions by nation, the United States here at the heel, China up there. But then you can also look at this as per capita emissions. And so as you start to look at by nation, there's often this naming and shaming of certain countries that are seen to be laggards in engagement on climate change, right? So for a number of years, from the late 90s, from the signing of the Kyoto Protocol to even recently, that there had been a lot of naming and shaming of India and China at the country level. Now, it's really changed dramatically since the recent presidential election and some of the wavering of the United States position on unsigning, if you will, the Paris Climate Agreement. Incidentally, the Paris Climate Agreement that's been signed by 195 of 197 nations. So if the U.S. decides to unsign that, they'll join the distinguished company of, anyone know this little bit of trivia, the two countries? No, not North Korea. What's that? UN member states, Nicaragua and Syria are the two. And of course, as I say that, there are a lot of embedded reasons why. But when moving from that country level to per capita, the picture can very much change. And so one's culpability, one's contribution to this big issue in the 21st century can change dramatically as well. So, I have 2 kids, for example, and statistically speaking, on average, those 2 kids produce as much as 500 children, say in Sudan, in other countries, in terms of their relative contribution to greenhouse gas emissions during their lifetimes. And so we can look at this in order to find where are there levers for change. We can certainly look at culpability, but then we can also change the picture and look at ways in which we can engage on this issue collectively. Another way to look at this yes, please. So per capita up here, in this case, U.S. Virgin Islands, Netherlands Antilles, this is Gibraltar. And there are a lot of reasons why those stand out as well. Yep. So looking at this on the aggregate level, there's another way of describing this as the Earth's carbon budget. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an assessment report. It was begun, the first report came out in 1990. The 5th report came out in 2013. There are preparations for a 6th report. This can also run the risk of that scientific way of knowing, more information, more information. These are still very useful in terms of providing an assessment, an aggregate of peer-reviewed peer-reviewed scientific ways of knowing about climate change. In this 5th assessment report, they talked about the trajectory that we're on, and they talked about how 500 gigatons, so 1 billion tons, can be emitted before crossing what's been called this 2-degree temperature threshold, which is a dangerous threshold to cross. There's a history of how that has been developed as well. But the question then becomes, how does one allocate the remaining emissions amongst countries, amongst people, those who have been developing through high carbon polluting ways? Are they then not able to access this final allotted set of emissions? How does that break out? And that's where you can give rise to many, I think, provocative, political, and sometimes productive discussions about how to then allocate the remaining emissions before crossing that dangerous threshold. So a lot of this can be captured through climate risk management, how to decide what to do about this issue. And so it can get broken up into 2 main ways. First, mitigation, the human intervention to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases, efficiency improvements, mode switching, and then adaptation, a way to adapt to the already existing commitments. So you can think about it in the first case, in shorthand, how to protect the climate from us, and in the second, how to protect ourselves from the climate and the dynamism, the agency of the climate. And so these are just entry points, really, for talking about these issues. And you mentioned, Martin, in your introduction about a film that's coming out describing coal country. And there are definite challenges of cutting coal dependence that come along economic lines, principally, but definitely cultural and political lines, societal lines as well. And this has been something that's discussed, of how to transition from carbon economies, and I describe them, to new carbon economies, or how to decarbonize, right? To move from carbon-based energy generation, coal, oil, natural gas, into a decarbonized space, mode switching into renewable energy sources and so forth. This is never going to be easy. This cuts right to the heart of everything about our industry, about our transportation systems, about our household use, about our food production, so forth and so on. There was a recent New York Times piece. Some of you may have seen this, I think it was about a month ago now, or maybe just a few weeks ago, that talked about jobs, that this often environmental decisions can be discussed, couched in the language of jobs. And so here you can see the existing jobs within oil here, natural gas, coal, which is highlighted, and the solar industry, which is more than double the coal jobs in the United States. Bioenergy, wind, hydroelectric, and nuclear. Geothermal takes up this smaller piece here as well. This is not to say it's simply a matter of numbers. I mean, these are symbolic actors in society. I would recommend, if you're interested, there is a beautiful project out of the University of North Carolina called Coal, A Love Story. And it's faculty and students out of the School of Communication that have worked together to really talk about how there has been this commitment over many generations and this identification through coal. But really just looking at the numbers, the number of coal jobs is actually just half that of solar, and it is changing all the time. And, some of the questions may come up about decisions of our current president, Donald Trump, and some of his symbolic actions to revive the coal industry. Unfortunately, in terms of jobs and people's lives, that this is like a commitment to saving the 8-track tape industry. But even economically speaking, that there are market forces that are very strong here. So he's swimming upstream against this strong current, pushing towards renewables. So I mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement. For those who aren't, steeped in this sort of thing, just very briefly, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was established in 1992 at the Rio Summit, which was the first step towards the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And so in 1995 began a series of Conference of Parties meetings to negotiate these different treaties. I've now been a part of 5 of them over time. The Paris Agreement itself was the 21st Conference of Parties meeting. So Kyoto in 1997, and then Paris in 2015, which took quite a long time to achieve a successor agreement to carry on. And I'm happy to talk about the intricacies of this as well. It had many signatories, as I mentioned, 195 of the 197 member states, just as of this month, as of a few weeks ago. 147 countries have also deposited their instruments of ratification, taking the next step beyond that, accounting for a total of 83.6% of total greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, the way in which the Kyoto Protocol and this agreement have been set up is that they needed to cross the threshold of 55 countries and 55% of global emissions in order for it to start the process of entry into force. And so this has certainly surpassed that in many dimensions. The idea is that if there aren't enough countries on board, there are actually weak mechanisms for enforcement. That if there aren't enough countries that have made commitments that represent more of the greenhouse gas emissions, that it isn't a strong agreement. But this is far and away beyond that. Nonetheless, here in the United States context, this is just drawing from Breitbart. There's a lot of places to get your news. Energy Secretary Perry had talked about renegotiating the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And for those of you who are following, up till today, there's still a lot of speculation. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has just said that President Trump is going to wait until after the G7 summit this weekend before he comes back to the United States, reevaluates. In the meantime, he's met with the Pope, who's had a few things to say. You may have heard that he passed him a copy of the encyclical from 2015 along with a letter encouraging him to take action, to stick with the agreements from the United States. And there is a lot of speculation. I just pulled this out of the Hindustan Times in Mumbai. Delaying action on the Paris climate deal. The world is watching what the United States chooses to do. So on one hand, the world is watching because the United States has been a leader on these issues. The United States has been an important player in this. The United States is also in some ways the belly of the beast. That carbon-based industry very much resides, the power base of carbon-based industry resides in the United States. Having said that, there are still, if the United States unsigns this agreement, 194 nations that have signed on. So things will carry on. Most recently, I was in Marrakesh just after the election of President Trump, and there was a lot of speculation, there was a lot of reflection on where this agreement stood, and looking to those market forces towards decarbonization, looking to the other member nations still pressing forward on this. The United States perhaps at best risks taking up an isolationist stance on this and really missing out on these opportunities to engage on these issues, not to mention the alleviating climate impacts. So we can talk more about that if you'd like. Just stepping back into this broadly, This stuff isn't easy. Governance of the changing climate is probably the most complex environmental diplomacy ever undertaken by the global political community, and that can be putting it mildly. Some of the complexities include scientific uncertainties over the magnitude of future climate change, the range of potential consequences. We can talk about these kinds of things if you like. The centrality and ubiquity of carbon, I alluded to this in terms of its embeddedness in human activities of all, I should say land use, industry, household energy use, the differences between contributors and those who bear the burden. I mentioned those at the forefront of climate impacts. In 1995, there was a very deliberate step taken in that first Conference of Parties meetings to talk about common but differentiated responsibilities. The Kyoto Protocol was actually designed around that, to have 35 industrialized nations making commitments for targets of reductions of greenhouse gas emissions with timetables as well. The Paris Climate Agreement has tried to be much more flexible. It's involved all member nations. And so this still continues to lurk about those that have historically contributed and those who bear the burden. There are certainly upfront costs. And again, this is not easy to revamp carbon industry and society. The time horizons that are combined with it, economic impacts of action make this a very challenging problem. And then finally, institutional arrangements. How to best configure organizations to deal with mitigation and adaptation challenges. There is a complex web in the United States, for example, of different departments that are dealing with different dimensions of this issue that permeates all aspects of our lives. But there are ways in which there is a lot of institutional complexity that can get in the way rather than facilitate engagement on this issue. There is, maybe I will get a little bit academic here and just saying that there's this notion of, by Funtowitz and Rivets, who have talked about how there's an important dimension of this that we have to acknowledge that these issues go beyond certain science, that they go beyond this notion of value-free or objective ways of viewing the world. That the ways in which we approach it, the ways in which we set up our research questions, the ways in which we choose to examine this phenomena of climate change reflects our values as a global community. So the contemporary science policy space is filled with dimensions of uncertainty about what are facts, and we can talk about facts as well, disputed values, high stakes, and those politicized alternatives for action. So importantly, with all of this in mind, Andrew Hoffman has written a really good book about the cultural dimensions of climate change. And he talked about the debate over climate change has become not about carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas models. It's about opposing cultural values and worldviews through which that science is seen. So oftentimes the scientific debates that you see at the surface are undergirded by many of these cultural values and worldviews debates that take place. So another way of looking at this, I draw on Granger Morgan's work, basically on three dimensions. First, on the y-axis, looking upwards here, the time that's required. I talked about this. The time that's required to engage with this issue is not just the political election cycle. It's not just our own lifetimes. This is bigger than us on a temporal scale, that this is looking across centuries of commitments and dealing with those commitments. Here, looking at the resources that are required, cutting to the heart of the way in which we're living, and then finally the cultural and political distance between parties that are involved. At the international level, it is both fascinating and frightening to see the challenges that are involved in bridging these cultural spaces. So often the perceived domain of climate change engagement is out in the distance that is overrun with our everyday challenges of healthcare, quality schools for our children, the everyday challenges. Climate change is often seen as a distant threat. And so it can be very difficult to engage with people effectively on this issue when they're perceived as dealing with all of these things in the long term. Nonetheless, we've had some moments in time just last month, right? Some of you may have participated in some of these events. I see Martin's shirt. There was the Science March and then the Climate March. And so a few of my favorite, actually, signs. You can see that a reluctance of the scientific community to engage in this way. But nonetheless, there were people that came out all over the world to talk about the importance of science as a way of knowing about these issues, and then also talking from many different perspectives about the challenges and the importance of addressing climate change with the People's Climate March. So overcoming all of this, people have been engaging. We can discuss and perhaps debate whether these are optimal ways of that kind of engagement, but it has definitely prompted those kinds of discussions in new and productive ways. So one of the things that we do at the University of Colorado in our center is that we have what's called a Media and Climate Change Observatory. We essentially are now tracking 53 different sources across 28 countries and just tracking the ebbs and flows. This is the world look at coverage. And so you can get a sense of just when are discussions bubbling up, and then we can start to look at what is involved in them. So at the global level, you can see some trends that 2007 into 2008 was a time of sustained engagement. A lot of the ways in which I talk about this is that there are different maybe themes that are taken up. The first being political themes, political ways of engaging with this issue. The second is scientific. I've been talking some about that. The third is ecological or meteorological events and issues themselves. So you can think about hurricanes, droughts, floods. And then finally, cultural dimensions of this issue. And so tracking these ebbs and flows, you can see that when there is sustained engagement, it can be the merging of a number of these different themes coming together. So 2007 into 2008, the IPCC, fourth assessment report at that time, the traction that was gained through Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, winning him the Nobel Prize with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was part of that story. In 2009, this was the Copenhagen talks. There was a lot of anticipation as Barack Obama was stepping into office about really moving forward in an assertive manner on the successor agreement to Kyoto. This was preceded just by a few weeks or a week by the University of East Anglia email hacking scandal, affectionately called ClimateGate, that had generated a lot of press here in the United States. I can go on and on talking about a lot of these peaks and valleys, but finally just the Paris climate talks and ratifications really punctuated the amount of media coverage here. We scale this down to 9 different countries as well, so you can go to our website and take a look at this. In the United States, it can be also very interesting to look at this. If you look at the end here, that the amount of coverage of climate change has gone up dramatically in recent months, over the last 6 months, really. And so we can start to look at why. When George W. Bush at the time had abandoned the Kyoto Protocol, that generated this peak here. The Clean Power Plan, a number of the concerted actions, cultural, political, scientific, ecological, meteorological, coming together during this period, had sustained engagement, but then Trump administration actions have really generated a lot of discussion. So another thing that we do at this Media and Climate Change Observatory is that we then use this as an opportunity to look at then the content itself. And so if you take a look at this, we have monthly summaries and we start to discuss what are the kinds of issues that have generated a lot of media coverage. And we had grown to better understand this recent peak as Trump-infused discussions, which can then displace. So on its face, you could say more media coverage can be more opportunities for engaging in this issue. But the associations and the speculations about Trump administration actions had really then displaced what we saw as productive discussion on a range of other issues, from mitigation to adaptation. So we've done a number of word clouds that you can check out there. I didn't actually put any up here, but the imprint of the word Trump is all over this increase in coverage, but debatably, it's not productive. So, as we move into questions about content, I had promised to talk a little bit about media coverage. I've written a book on this called Who Speaks for the Climate, which is 5 years old now. But many of these things still bubble up. And you can see from James Inhofe in the winter of, February 2015, where he stood on the floor of the US Senate with a snowball in a recent snowstorm and called into question global warming. Because of that, snow event, that generates a great deal of media attention. And again, more attention should not be equated with more public understanding or clarity on these issues. But some of the contributing influences that I, along with many collaborators over the years, have looked at are those weather events that can generate coverage, technical capacity issues in terms of the number of specialist journalists that are dedicated to that. Part of that bump that you see in 2017 is the New York Times staff that has allocated resources to cover climate change in a renewed way. This has also happened to The Guardian in the UK. I didn't put up that figure in the UK, but you can also see that. Perspectives and stances, those organizations and outlets with a pro-capitalist ideology take on a certain approach to these issues that may differ from others. Cultural differences, trust in media. There was actually just a survey that came out. You may have read about this, and I don't remember the source on this, but trust in media is at a definite low right now, and that can be part of the milieu of media influencing engagement on this issue. Political economic drivers and factors in terms of consolidation and independent voices on these issues. And then finally, journalistic norms themselves. And that can be the journalistic norm of balanced reporting. That can be a tendency to gravitate towards personalized issues with heroes, victims, villains. That can be a number of different ways of addressing this. So in terms of then pivoting to meeting people where they are, we are sitting in a moment of history where the top 12 warmest years, you can see their rank there, many of them in recent years. You can see the temperature anomalies over the last decades there, moving from blue to red, that we are situated in a very unique and challenging space. Mike Hume, who's a physical geographer from the UK, who's really moved into cultural human geography and engaged with this issue, has challenged us as a community to view global change as an opportunity to then break out of an existing toolkit and develop new formulations and new ways of knowing about this and new ways of engaging on this issue. And so in part, responding to that call, there have been burgeoning projects that are taking place. Some of you may be involved in a number of these, many that I don't have listed here. But the good news is that there are many ways that different organizations, different people are creatively engaging with this issue, trying to meet people where they are, trying to open up new conversations. And so I could talk about a number of these different projects. I'm involved in some of them, but I just want to focus on this one inside the greenhouse that's at the University of Colorado. This is a project that I've been involved in with Professor Becca Safran, who's a professor in ecology, and Professor Beth Osnes, who's a theater professor at the university. And we've been working now together in a coordinated fashion since 2012. We've developed a 2-course series which tries to create a space where we focused in on undergraduate students so far, and we may bridge this into grad students and others, but to then experiment with creative modes to communicate and then evaluate and confront climate change. And so among those projects that we've been involved in, I'll just provide 3 examples. And so Beth Osnes, the theater professor, and I had taught a class which had 40, mostly seniors that have graduated just in the last weeks, and we engaged in 3 different projects. The first project of that is that we partnered with a group called More Than Scientists. Has anybody heard of More Than Scientists as an organization? So I highly encourage you to check this out. They end up working to interview scientists and climate researchers all over the world to draw out their human stories, why they do what they do. We could sit up here and talk about the expert dimensions of our work, but we could also take a different tact and talk about our motivations. And so we at the University of Colorado have partnered with them, and now we've produced maybe 30, I think 36, 38 different portrayals of climate scientists in this larger area, from NREL, NCAR, university, CRES, INSTAR, so forth and so on. So our students had gone out to interview them, to build up their technical skills in interviewing and working with the equipment, and then also their creative skills and trying to help tell their stories. I mean, this can be resonant with the workshop that you have coming up as well. And we've been really excited with the results. Empowering these folks to tell those stories, they tell the stories in ways that we wouldn't conceptualize telling the stories, that we all have valuable perspectives and we all have different perspectives on these issues. So that has been highly successful. And at our Inside the Greenhouse site, you can watch through all the videos if you'd like. A second project, we've actually twisted things up and forced participants to take part in an experiment on comedy about climate change. So with the levity that's involved here, there is always that danger of trivializing a tremendously important issue. And so we are consistent in reminding everybody that's involved that they don't want to fall into that trap. But nonetheless, we have worked with students for the last couple of years now to engage in this way. And we've seen comedy emerging. Some of you may get your news from The Daily Show. You may get your news from last week tonight, from Samantha Bee, who's my favorite, from others. And we are trying to harness the power of comedy in order to engage in this way. That sometimes those scientific ways of knowing become hackneyed, become old and tired. And this has proven to be provocative, surely, and at times successful. And part of our evaluation strategy is trying to see success for whom and what audiences. And then the third project that we're involved in, we've partnered with a local group called Recycled Runway. Has anybody heard of this organization, Recycled Runway? So this is an organization based in Boulder, and it's been replicated in other places, working with designers from 6th to 12th grade, mostly young women, who take recycled materials and turn it into fashion. And this has been an amazing way to empower young people to think about not just the things that they may already be interested in fashion, but then also think about environmental impacts, waste diversion, water consumption, all these different issues. So we had gotten students at the University of Colorado to end up tracking designers and tracking the process and covering the event, which filled up Boulder Theater in April, and then telling their stories as well. And it was a fascinating way of engaging new audiences, not just the designers themselves, but their families and their friends and others in the community, to try and provide these bridges into discussions about climate change. And so these are just the beginning. It's also empowered our own students along the way of all three of these projects. This is just the beginning of trying to investigate in a very systematic way what works, how, when, and why, under what conditions, with what effects. And so part of the work that I'm committed to and involved in the social sciences has moved into trying to assess how to successfully and creatively work into these spaces and open up conversations and engagement on climate change. So I'm happy to talk about all of these things. I see that I'm already past 8 o'clock. In terms of engagement in the 21st century, I end up, we're all working at in different spaces and with commitments in different ways. I take up my commitments working with undergraduates and graduate students from Introduction to Environmental Studies, which is an intimate gathering of 425 impressionable young minds in the fall, up to graduate level seminars where I teach on climate politics and policy. But that's where I end up investing a lot of my time and energy, and really helping people empower themselves to realize that things aren't just made in there before them to just accept at face value, but things can be unmade, things can be made differently. And so, there's been increasing discussions of how to effectively engage with people on this challenge. And so I've been leaning into that challenge, and I've been involved in a lot of that work. So on that topic, I'm writing a book that's trying to aggregate all this on creative climate communications that I'll have out next year. So I hope that is good food for thought. And I will just also mention that this is the center where I'm director. And has anybody been up to Boulder, come to our center before? We have talks all the time. Great. We have all kinds of events. If you go to our homepage, you can get on the listserv. You can start to track these things. We'd be happy to have each and every one of you all the time, even though our room wouldn't hold this many people at once. but we'd count on just a percentage of you guys showing up. We got all kinds of great things that are going on. We're actually celebrating our 15th anniversary this fall, and so we have a few invitations out to some high-profile speakers so you can keep track of who we end up bringing in for that. And so with that, I just thank you for taking the time with me, and welcome questions.